Linda and I met at the age of 16 at my brother and her sister's wedding. Yes, my brother Terry married Linda's sister. We have 3 boys, they have 2 boys, so we have double cousins, which just makes it interesting. Linda and I didn't particularly like each other in high school when we met as sophomores. She didn't like me, I didn't really care for her. But 4 years later, we met in September after I broke up with the girl that I met as a freshman in college. We dated for 9 months, Linda and I, and without reading any books on marriage or without any premarital counseling, you know, back then they didn't have that, we got married, not knowing what we didn't know. When we got married, I knew very little about how wives think. There had not been a girl born in the Clark side when we got married for 150 years. That's 6 generations. So there wasn't much I knew about girls. I even knew less about marriage or how to love my wife. Lynn and I were very different. I was introverted.
I'm an extroverted.
I was a cautious, task-oriented, and wanted to achieve and accomplish type person.
I'm very spontaneous. I like people and I like to have fun.
Well, we later found out that those traits pretty well define who we are and really define our marriage. I grew up in town. My dad was a shoe repairman.
I grew up on a farm and my dad was a farmer and raised cattle. My family was very affectionate and we hugged a lot.
My family was not affectionate. We did not hug. And we were seldom showing affection to one another. If you've been around Linda for any length of time, you'll find out, if you haven't already, that she's a hugger. I was very detail-oriented, factual, methodical, logical. I would like to plan every part of our lives with a purpose.
I'm, on the other hand, I saw the big picture. My number one goal in life was to make relationships and just have fun.
The differences didn't stop there. I had 9 things on my bathroom sink.
I have 149 things just in case.
I was a cleanie.
I'm a messy.
I like to have everything in order, in a row, orderly, systematic, alphabetized if possible.
And I have my own way of organizing things. I keep things in stacks. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. I know exactly where everything is according to the stack that it's in.
That's very true. I cannot believe how she does this. I'll ask her something and she'll go right to it in which stack it is in. It was not that she was better than me, nor I was better than her. The fact was we were just 2 completely different people. So, since we were complete opposites, we had completely different expectations. My expectation for her was to be like me, or at least be willing to become like me.
And my expectation for him was to be the man of my dreams, you know, the man I always dreamed of.
So, for the first 13 years of our marriage, I tried to change her to think like me, to be like me, but it didn't work. That just seemed like the right thing to do. See, I didn't realize how selfish and self-centered I had become. It took some time, but I finally realized that Linda was not the cause of my unhappiness. My own selfish, self-centered beliefs, values, and expectations was what created my unhappiness with Linda.
And in my own way, I wanted to change Jerry to be just like me. All of the differences became wedges that gradually began to drive us apart from one another. And in our early years of marriage, we basically quit going to church and started going the world's way. And man, that was a big mistake and caused many problems in our lives.
So for the next several years in our marriage, I can't tell you how our marriage took a big turn for the worse. As we became more selfish with each other, we became more distant with God. I became more critical, demanding, and unappreciative of Linda as a person. The problem was not that I was just using the wrong words. The problem was that I had the wrong heart. It wasn't just that I was using incorrect techniques. The problem was my heart was wrong. My heart was not right. Therefore, my motives, my attitudes, my words, and my actions were also not right.
And we realized that we had unknowingly developed idols in our lives through our selfish ways and our thinking. Looking back, I see now that how God given desires are found in Psalms 37:4, and it says, Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. So when we got married, I believed in the fairy tale syndrome. They always lived happily ever after. Well, that was not to be. I had a desire for Jerry to be like my dad. And with my insecurity, I began to place what I'd idolized in my dad onto Jerry. I needed the same acceptance and approval from him as I'd received from my dad. And the problem was my desire was not being met according to what I wanted and the way I wanted. So I kept thinking about it over and over of this desire, and soon it escalated into a need. Now I needed it. And it wasn't long after that we bought a business, and we started making more money than we ever dreamed we'd ever have. And it turns out the more money we made, the more we tried to find new ways to fill that need of emptiness by gaining material possessions. And we were living more for ourselves than for God. And that need then became, in my life, the meaning and value, and my acceptance could not be fulfilled through these material possessions even. And then since my needs weren't being met, they escalated to a demand. Now I demanded my desire. And as long as I went along with these demands were not being met and satisfied, the next level, I began to judge Jerry. And then finally from judging, it became punishing him. And when my desires had turned to needs, and my needs turned into demands that were not being met, then I judged, and then finally to the punishment stage. And that's the way the idol of progression goes.
When we were meandering and drifting in our marriage and in our spiritual lives, we actually didn't know how far off in the ditch we'd really gone. I too began realizing that having more of anything and everything was not going to fill that hole in my heart, that void in my soul. Our identities and our lives were wrapped around what we owned, how we looked. So my identity became further rooted in physical type things. I began to assign value to the things in my life based upon what I thought they were worth according to the world. My materialistic values had begun to determine my priorities. My worldly focus began to control my focus, my attention, and my thoughts. Who I was, my identity, was based on the size of the house I lived in, the kind of car I drove, and the kind of clothes that I wore. See, as a complacent Christian, I was not being sensitive to sin. I learned that the God of materialism doesn't come alongside of you and say, hey, can I help you live your life? No, that God, small g, of materialism had completely taken over my life, which was a huge insult to God. Neither of us knew what it meant to be a godly husband or a godly wife. We continued to live a religious, moral life, but we both felt there should be more to the Christian life than what we had. There was just an emptiness in our soul. So this morning we want to look at some ways, how do you deal with conflict in marriage? Because we had some conflicts that we had to work through. We had to learn to do them, work through them. So you can call them debates, you can call them conflicts or arguments, but every couple is going to have disagreements. So how does a husband typically deal with being confronted by his wife? Well, I don't know if you guys relate to this. This is what I did. When I was confronted by Linda, I had primarily three ways I dealt with it. One, I would give in. I'd rather give up than fight. Our pastor says, Tommy Nelson in the Bible, he says that a man, when he's being confronted, if there's conflict in the home, a man typically will not fight for his home. He will avoid it. He'll escape. Number two, I would escape and flee the scene, hoping the problem would take care of itself. Or three, I would assert my authority and try to gain control of the situation. But unfortunately, when I gave in, escaped, and fought over our differences, I never experienced the satisfaction that comes with effective conflict resolution.
And so how does a wife deal with being confronted by her husband? Wives, when you disagree with your husband about something, which one of these responses do you do? Number one, do you try to get the upper hand through manipulation and hiding the facts? Or 2, do you challenge your husband, especially when you think you know better? Or 3, do you pretty much do what he says because things will run more smoothly? But it should come as no surprise that none of these options will provide the satisfaction that you desire.
The Bible's clear about God's plan for communication. I mean, oftentimes we don't want to acknowledge it, but there are ways to handle conflict resolution in marriage. When husbands and wives commit themselves to one another, we see the outworkings of Christ's relationship with the church. You guys have James Tate walked you through Ephesians 5. Scripture commands that husbands are to selflessly love their wives, and wives are to respect their husbands. I'm not saying that. Paul said it because God told him to say it. So it's not difficult to see in a perfect world where these commandments were never broken that marriage could be peaceful and satisfying, but we don't live in a peaceful world. We don't live in an ideal world. We live in a fallen world. Our natural tendency is focus on ourselves and to attempt to oppose our will on others. So, any of my selfish attempts to get Linda to do things my way would often cause communication breakdowns. Those breakdowns often led to conflicts. So we learned there are 4 steps to working through conflicts that we had to learn. And probably every marriage has to learn that one way or the other. We'd like to share those with you today. They're on your outline. There's couples who don't like to admit it, but conflict is common in all marriages. There's a perfect recipe for marriage conflict, and we followed it to a T. I mean, when I go through a recipe, cooking, I follow it. Now, she doesn't. She just kind of throws in whatever she wants. First, you start with 2 selfish people with different backgrounds and personalities. That was her and I. City boy, country girl. Then you had some bad habits and some what I'll call them idiosyncrasies. You can call them you know what I mean. You throw in a bunch of expectations. You turn up the heat a little bit with all the trials of life that you're going to go through, and boom, what? You've just baked a conflict pie. It's unavoidable.
And since our marriage had its tensions, it isn't the question of avoiding them. It's just how are you going to deal with them? And we discovered that conflict can lead to a process that develops either oneness or isolation. And Jerry and I learned over time that we must choose what we say and how we act when a conflict occurs. We learned that these 4 steps we had to follow to work through our disagreements.
Step 1, resolving conflict requires knowing, accepting, and adjusting to the differences in your spouse. Like I said earlier, we tried to change each other for 13 years. That does not work. In Re-Engage, we talk about that. We put in a little circle and we say, step inside that circle and you can change anything you want to inside that circle. Outside that circle, you can change nothing. Well, one reason we have conflict in all marriages is that opposites attract. If I were to ask for a show of hands, which I won't, how many of you are different than your spouse? We probably would see some hands raised. Usually a task-oriented person, that would be me, marry someone who is a more people-oriented person, that would be her. I tend to move through life at a very fast pace, but often do not enjoy the present, but instead live anywhere from 5 weeks to 5 years in the future. Looking back, I now see with 20/20 vision that life is what happens to you while you're planning to do something else. I married Linda, who is much slower paced, and she has taught me how to live in the present. See, it's really strange, but that's part of the reason why you married who you did. You would not marry somebody like yourself. That'd be boring. Your spouse has added a variety of spice and a difference to your marriage, to your life that you didn't have before. But after being married for a while, the things that attracted you can actually become repellents. You may argue over the smallest things, smallest irritations, like how do you squeeze the toothpaste properly? She was a squeezer in the middle. I was from the bottom and roll it up. I don't know if anybody can relate. And then another biggie is which way do you turn the toilet paper, over or under? That was a biggie, see? And so we had to work through those things. It's important to not only see, acknowledge, but to accept these differences and then adjust to them. Because just as Adam was given Eve, he had to accept what God had given him. And likewise, you are called to accept God's gift to you. God gave me Linda, who completes me in ways that I hadn't even become aware of yet.
And step number 2, resolving conflict requires defeating selfishness. All of our differences are magnified in marriage because they feed what is undoubtedly the biggest source of our conflict. It's my selfish and sinful nature. Two people beginning marriage together who are trying to go their own selfish, separate ways can never hope to experience the oneness of marriage that God has intended. The prophet Isaiah portrayed this problem really accurately 2,500 years ago when he described the human basic selfishness like this. He said, all of us like sheep have gone astray. We have turned to, each of us has turned to his own way. I don't like to admit it, but I can be selfish and self-centered. In different ways, I believe we all instinctively think of ourselves as number one, and that leads to conflict. Our marriage has provided many opportunities to do something about our selfishness. And we've seen God's plan in the Bible and that it works in our lives, and it's still working in our life daily. Jerry and I have not changed each other. We have learned we cannot do that, but by the grace of God, God has changed us. And the answer for ending selfishness is found in the teachings of Jesus. He showed me that instead of wanting to be first, I must be willing to be last. Instead of wanting to be served, I must serve. And instead of trying to save my life, I must be willing to lose my life for Christ. And to make the long story short, I learned that if I want to defeat selfishness, I must be willing to give up, to give in, and to give all, as Paul describes in Philippians 2. To experience oneness, I learned that I must give up my will for the will of another. But to do this, I must first give up my will to Christ, and then and only then would I find it possible to give my will up for Jerry's. And I learned that it was no longer that I lived, but Christ lived in me. Jerry and I are a team, and it had to become that it was no longer my way or his way, but it was our way with God's help.
Well, step 3, we had to learn that resolving conflict requires pursuing the other person. So what's that mean? Romans 12:18 says it pretty well. If it's possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. You know, the longer I live, the more I realize how difficult those words are for many couples. To live peaceably actually means to pursue peace. For me, it meant I needed to take the initiative to resolve a conflict with Linda rather than waiting for her to take the first step. To pursue working through the conflict means I have to set my own hurt, my frustration, my anger aside to be able to seek peace with her. The only way I found out way that works is to keep my relationship current with the Lord and current with Linda. In other words, I have to commit daily to be in solid fellowship with the Lord and with my wife. I believe Satan does the most effective work in our life, your life, by isolating us by ourselves. When we get off on our own, then he is able to take us down because I'm too weak and I'm not smart enough to be able to deal effectively with Satan.
Step 4, resolving conflict requires loving confrontation. Blessed is the marriage where both spouses feel the other is a good friend who will listen, who will understand, and work through any problem or conflict. And to do this well takes loving confrontation. Confronting your spouse with grace and tactfulness requires wisdom, patience, and humility. So over the years, we have learned to do some things together and not things to do and not do in confronting each other. We have tried to follow the 10 principles to love and confront each other. And the first one is to check your motivation. Before I speak, I try to think, will my words help or hurt the situation? Will bringing up this cause healing, wholeness, and oneness, or will it cause further isolation?
Number two is check your attitude. That's something I had to constantly do because when a thought goes into my feelings and the feeling and the thought combine, it forms an attitude, and that's when it can take over. So my attitude makes a difference in not only what I say, but how I say it. I could say the same thing 3 different ways, and she could have 3 different meanings. My goal is to confront Linda lovingly and to communicate that I care about her in what I say to her. So I want her to know that I love for her and care for her when I confront her. I want to know how she feels because she is God's gift to me. She completes me. So I had to learn to not hop on my bulldozer, which sometimes men are good at doing. I'd put it in the lowest gear and I'd just plow and run right over her and not even realize I'd done it. So to approach and confront Linda lovingly is something that I had to learn and I'm still learning.
And number 3, check the circumstances. This includes timing, location, and the setting. I learned that it was impossible for me to really get what I needed across to Jerry if I started to meet him at the door and start telling him all the bad things that I wanted corrected after a hard day's work. It just didn't work. Or if he was in communication with the kids, maybe there was a squabble with the kids. I learned that was not a good time for me to confront. Also, I learned that I was never to criticize or make fun of or correct or argue with Jerry in public. I had to learn that doing these things undercut the respect that I wanted from him, or the respect that he needed from me, and the love that I wanted from him.
Well, number 4, sometimes we don't realize this can be an issue, but I have to always check and see what other pressures are present in her life. I had to learn to be sensitive to what other things are going on in her life so that I know how to approach and what to say to her. If I make everything all about me, then I won't be concerned about what she's going through. So although I often fail, I try to look at the situation, observe the circumstances that she's going through. Like if she's getting ready for a mission trip coming up in October, the week before, it's a pretty pressure-filled week. I know that I don't confront her, talk to her about serious things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Number 5, listen to your spouse. Listen well is one of the most powerful communications techniques I know of. Once I share my feelings, I make every effort to listen to Jerry's perspective. I try to lean in and be present and make eye contact with him. I have learned that if my body language contradicts what I say, then it communicates that I'm not listening to him. And another thing, don't interrupt when he's talking. Instead of listening, I can't be thinking about what I want to say next. So when I'm about to speak, I have to ask myself, is this really necessary?
Another thing that men aren't often guilty of, women are, but I'm guilty in this case of number 6. Define the problem, stick with the issue. Because what happens, I begin to realize that when we're in conflict, I would bring up several issues at one time instead of addressing the main issue. Most of the time women are historical, but in this case, I can be historical. I would save up a series of complaints and I'd back the truck up and I would dump them all at once in her lap. Unfortunately, it made it very difficult to clearly define the main issue because all of this other things were coming in. All of the angry words, past issues, old hurts were tossed into the mix.
Yeah. And number 7, focus on the problem rather than the person. I remember the first time we tried to set up a budget in our marriage. One of us was a saver and one of us was a spender, and I won't tell you which was which. But my tendency was to be focused on our differences and to blame Jerry that we were in such financial difficulties, and then he would blame me. I learned I couldn't make him my enemy, but instead I needed to focus on what was going on. And at this time, we were making out a budget. So I had to focus on let's get the budget made and stop the blaming. The key was to develop a plan for our finances and not to magnify our differences.
Then number 8, focus on behavior rather than on character. This is using the you message instead of the I message versus the I message. See, I could easily assassinate Linda's character with stab her right in the heart by using you messages. You know what? You always do that. You're always late. I'm early. She's not early. You don't care about me at all. You don't care about anyone but yourself. See, when I use you message, it gives the wrong message. I learned that I needed to affirm the relationship before trying to define the problem. I needed to learn that I need to start saying this with I messages rather than with a you message. Linda, our relationship is important to me. But when you don't return my calls, I feel like you're ignoring me. Rather than saying you never or you always.
And then number 9 is focus on the facts rather than judging the motives. For example, early on in our marriage, if Jerry forgot to make an important phone call, I would judge him and say, I cannot believe how careless you are. But obviously, saying such things only made the situation worse. Instead, I needed to find the reason why he didn't make the phone call rather than judge his actions.
Well, number 10, above all, focus on understanding your spouse rather than focusing on winning or losing. I was not very good at remembering that love keeps no record of wrongs. It's 1 Corinthians 13. I didn't get historical, but like I said, I did get historical. I had my own personal scorebook, and I kept track of wins and losses that I had not completely forgiven that could help me win the current argument. Lynn and I had to learn the hard way that we needed to be quick to forgive, quick to admit our mistakes, and then move on from the conflict that we just had. I had to learn that when Linda confronted me, I needed to make every effort to learn to listen to what she said and what she didn't say. For example, if I get home from work and see that Linda's upset about something, I have to take into account and be understanding that she may not be upset with me at all, but she may have had a rotten day.
And then lastly, with this, resolving conflict requires forgiveness. No matter how hard Jerry and I try to love and please one another, we are still going to hurt and we're going to fail one another. But with failure comes hurt, and the only ultimate relief of this hurt is to soothing salve of forgiveness. The key to maintaining an open, intimate, and happy marriage is to ask for and grant forgiveness quickly.
That last verse in chapter 4 of Ephesians is something I had to remember. I have to consistently bring it to my mind because Paul talks about that. He says, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has forgiven you. See, forgiveness did not come easy for me.
Sorry.
My natural instinct was to recoil in self-protection when I got hurt. I didn't naturally overflow with mercy, grace, and forgiveness when I'd been wronged. However, when I began to realize the huge debt of wrongs that I'd been forgiven by God, even though I didn't deserve it, that helped me to understand that He wants me to also forgive my wife when she's offended me. Jesus has made it crystal clear to me that forgiveness is a choice. I have to choose whether or not I'm going to forgive. I have to voluntarily choose to forgive Linda through a decision of my will, which is motivated by obedience to God and His command to forgive. Now, that's kind of a mouthful, but let me say it once more. I have to voluntarily choose to forgive Linda through a decision of my will, which is motivated by obedience to God and His command to forgive. When I choose to forgive, then the Lord sets my heart free from the hurt, the resentment, the bitterness that has been allowed to build there.
that had previously imprisoned me. The point is, we all have a choice to forgive or not to forgive. I can either choose to hold on to the things that build walls of resentment, or I can forgive the person and release that person from the debt and release them from that debt, canceling it. I have learned that forgiveness is a process, not an event. It is not accomplished in one step or one day. Forgiveness takes time. It can take days, weeks, months. I've even seen years where it took time, that length of time, for people to forgive. I had to learn the hard way that the only way I can practice forgiveness is by putting forgiveness in my words, my attitudes, and my actions. I had to learn that forgiveness does not imply that I forget what happened or erase the incident from my memory. Forgiveness means that I make a choice to forgive. It's an act of my will. Even though it doesn't feel good, I choose to forgive. Release the offender from the guilt, no longer hold the offense over their head. So we had to both choose to recognize destructive conflict. It was going on in our marriage, but we had to choose to recognize it and choose to stop it. The only way Lynn and I have found to stop destructive conflict in our marriage is to practice forgiveness. And there's 4 promises that we have to keep. We want to just look at those now. Number 1, we have to promise that we won't bring an old issue up and use it against each other in the future. Number 2, we have to promise that we won't dwell on it in our hearts and our minds. Number 3, we have to promise we won't talk about it with other people. See, that's one of the things I find that young people do, is they tell their family, their friends, their coworkers, and he tells his, and so then you have these conflicts going on outside of the marriage. So they resolve their conflict, and the people are still in conflict outside of the marriage. Number 4, we have to promise we won't let it stand between us or hinder our personal relationship.
And I learned that the only way I could do these 4 promises was being my relationship with God. It had to be strong. And for me, that meant I had to give up my resentment and that urge and desire to punish. And even though it was not easy, and it's still not easy, I had to choose with the act of my will to let Jerry off the hook. I had to learn to forgive in my heart with love and a gentle spirit. And Ephesians 4:23 teaches me how to forgive with that kind of a heart. It says, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has also forgiven you." In that verse, and along with Ephesians 5:21, Paul gives the basis for being able to avoid conflict. He says, "Be subject to one another out of reverence or fear of Christ." For me, I had to learn the hard way what it means to be subject to one another. I believe Paul wanted me to see that all these relationships are patterned after Christ's relationship to his church. Ultimately, Paul is saying that husbands and wives are to be subject to one another out of reverence or fear for Christ. And basically, the issue biblically here is the reputation of God himself. So only then did Jerry and I begin to discover the richness of God's plan for marriage and accept the fact that mutual submission is the cornerstone to the family order. We were slow learners, and it took us many years to learn this, and we're still learning every day. And it often feels like we just haven't even scratched the surface. Jerry and I both have learned that to grow, we must submit to each other out of reverence for Christ.
Paul ended this section on marriage in verse 33 of chapter 5. I think James left this verse. He went through all the verses except verse 33. Paul says, "Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." When I ask Christian men, what is your primary responsibility in the home? It's always interesting because many of them reply like I would have replied in our marriage many years before. I would have said to be the head of the home. But when the Apostle Paul speaks to the husband, he does not say, "Husbands, be the head of your house as Christ is the head of the church." Rather, in verse 25, he says, "Husband, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So, a husband's responsibility is what? Not to be the head of the hot wife first, but to sacrificially love his wife as Christ sacrificially loved us. Paul is saying that is the primary way that a husband can exercise headship to his wife in the home. It's by loving her sacrificially. He takes us back to verse 21. That applies to all Christians, that we're to be subject to one another. Why? Out of reverence for Christ. You know, I have personally found this impossible to do without developing a humble servant attitude. I have to make a willful choice every day to lay aside my rights, my selfish interests, and seek the good of my wife, and because I reverence the Lord, am subject to him. See, in these verses that we just looked at, Paul described love as something I must do, not just something that I must say or feel. As a husband, I could say, I love you to my wife all day long. But when I show up late from work every day without calling, my actions are going to speak louder than my words. If I really love my wife, I'm going to back it up with my actions. Jesus modeled sacrificial love in his life. Jesus demonstrated his love for me sacrificially when he died on the cross for my sins. Now, as one of his children, I can demonstrate love for my wife by being sacrificial. So how does this translate into marriage? If you don't remember anything else that we've said today, I want you to remember this. I show love for Linda through my actions when I sacrificially do things for her, but here's the kicker, without expecting anything in return.
And I show my love to Jerry through my actions when I sacrificially do things for him without expecting anything in return. However, the fact is that what we do is far more important than the reason we do it.
I don't sacrificially love Linda because I have to. I sacrificially love her because I want to. God wants me to love her sacrificially the way he sacrificially loved me. If that's not my motive, then what happens is I will expect something in return for me sacrificing my love for her. Husbands, love your wife sacrificially as Christ loved the church, but do it without expecting anything in return. Wives, in the same way. Respect your husband as unto the Lord, but don't expect anything in return.
So how do we apply this to our everyday lives? How do we show love in your life? Your love for God and your love for your spouse is the only thing that is going to last. Everything else you do in life is temporary. Every single action of love that you make is going to last forever. The Bible says 3 things are going to last forever, and that is faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And God said, love will continue forever. If you want a legacy to last, if you want people to remember you, love them.
You know, I really hate to be the one to have to tell everybody this because I have to learn it myself. But people are not going to remember what you do. They're not going to remember your work. People are not going to remember your wealth. How many possessions you had there. People are never remembered by what they have made. They are remembered for what they gave away. They're remembered for their love. They remember you because they remember how you made them feel. Truth is, there's coming a day when all of the trophies that we have accumulated are going to be thrown out. Given enough time, somebody is going to throw away all of those things that we've accumulated on earth. Somebody may have that bowling trophy that they got years ago, and they look at it. Maybe it's a report card. It might be a merit badge. It could be some type of certificate of achievement, a diploma. Nobody's going to remember those things. I doubt if many of you have the rewards that your grandparents received. Maybe a few, but typically they get thrown out. You pick them up in garage sales. I have stood by many bedsides when people were getting ready to pass from this world into the next world. I've never had one person ask me if they could look at their certificate of award one last time. I've never had one person ask, could you just let me see my bank balance one more time? Let me see that bowling trophy just once more. In fact, My mother passed away in February. My brother and I were beside the bed, and the only thing that she wanted at that point, 2 hours before she left this world, is she wanted her boys next to her. We spoke, even though she couldn't hear us, she was unconscious. We spoke. It spoke into her ear. We sang songs, and but it wasn't anything about what she was going to leave in this world.
People do want, when people are dying, they do want their loved ones around them. They want their friends around them that have loved them, and they have loved them. The Bible says in 1 Corinthians 13 that we are bankrupt without love. Everyone will eventually learn on their deathbed, if not before, that the only thing that matters is our relationships. Accomplishments aren't important when you're close to passing on from this world. You want people around you, not things. And the only things that last is that relationship. And if that's true, why do relationships always get the short end of the stick?
Well, the primary reason relationships always get the short end of the stick is that we're busy. We don't have time for people we love. We don't have time for the energy and the time or the resources that we think we need to love. When we get busy, we get preoccupied with things of lesser importance. We give first-class allegiance to second-class causes. When people get busy and get overloaded, they do what I call relational skimming. Relational skimming. People say, I don't have time to get it all done. So what I'll do is I'll skim on my relationships. I don't have time to spend in quiet time with the Lord. I don't have time to go to my small group. I don't have time to spend with my wife or my husband. I don't have time for relationships. That's called relational skimming. You start cutting back because you don't have enough time to get all your tasks done.
And we focus on the urgent and not what is important. We focus on reaching our goals and paying our bills and getting all our work done. And life is not about stuff. It's about relationships. 5 years from today, you won't care about those bills. But 5 years from now, you will care about relationships. We just have to put everything in perspective. Nothing can take the place of love. If your marriage relationship is messed up, you know life is not good. It doesn't matter how much money you have or how famous you are, your relationship is messed up. Your life is miserable without love.
One day that we're all going to stand before God in heaven. He may ask us, why should I let you in? But he also might ask, what did you do on earth? He's not going to say, hey, tell me about your career. I'm fascinated by that. Tell me how many jobs you had. How many sales did you make? How many deals did you close? He won't say, hey, show me your credit report. He's going to say, did you do on earth what I told you to do? Did you love me with all your heart? Did you love your wife sacrificially? Love her with all your heart. See, when it comes to relationships, a lot of times we know they are good things, but it's like we think they are something that we have to make time for. It's like we feel we need to schedule time for our relationships. It's like relationships are one more thing that we add to our schedule of life. No, relationships are your life. It's the only thing on this earth that does last. Your job and everything else is peripheral. Job is second, third, maybe fourth at best. God didn't put you and I here on earth for a job. He put us on this earth to love. If you're saying I need to squeeze my relationships into my schedule, you're missing the point.
God did not intend for life to be about accomplishments. He intended life to be about love. And busyness causes us to forget that. There's 2 laws of love. The first law is that the best use of life is to love. And the second law of love is the best expression of love is time. Love is spelled T-I-M-E. 1 John 3:18 says, we show our love through our actions, actions that are sincere. And the most desirable gift of love is not diamonds, chocolates, and flowers, like you might think so, but it isn't. The most desirable gift is love. It's focused attention. It's time. Give your time to your wife and your husband because it's the greatest gift you can give them. Why? Because time is your most precious resource that we have.
We all do have different amounts of energy. The older we get, we realize that. We all have different amounts of wealth. We all have different amounts of talent. But you know, there's one thing we all have the same amount of. That's time. We all have 168 hours per week. And you and I, we get to choose how we're going to use those hours. As an adult American, you can expect to live 25,550 days on this earth. Every minute I give you, every day, hour I give you, is time I'm never going to get back. I can always make more time, but I can never get more money.
No. Say that again.
I'm sorry. I can always get more money, but I can never make more time. You know, we only get a certain amount of days, so we have to choose wisely how we're going to use them. When you want to give up something very important for your spouse, don't give up time. Your time is the most valuable thing you have to give. Your time and attention is something that is a necessity, not optional. Why? Because when you give someone your time, you're saying, you matter to me. You're valuable. Jesus said the essence of real relationships is not what we give each other, but how much of what we give of ourselves. See, men, most of the time we don't get this. Most of the time men don't understand that what their wife and their children want is them. They want you. They want the husband. They want their dad. See, it's putting their needs, their interests, their desires above yours. Your wife doesn't need things, she needs you.
And one of the things that damages relationships between husband and wives is hurry. We walk fast, we talk fast, we eat fast, and we even say, "Oops, I'm sorry, I have to run." But the bad part about this is that God does not fit into our schedules any better than our spouse or our children do. And Chuck Swindoll says, busyness destroys relationships. Busyness substitutes frenzy for deep friendships. And it feeds the ego, but starves our relationships. It fills the calendar, but it fractures the family.
So how do I find more time to love those in my family? That's really the wrong question. The right question is, how do I love my family first, and then how do I fit everything else into my schedule that is left? We get it backwards. How do I do that? One suggestion is to turn off the TV and turn off the computer. It always amazes me that people will watch reruns of Friends, but they won't go out and make friends. They watch a reality show about somebody else's family, but they won't work on the reality of their own family. So it's almost become more of a spectator sport than it has been a participator. So husbands, make the commitment to sacrificially love your wife and give her your time without expecting anything in return. Wives, sacrificially love your husbands by respecting him and giving them your time without expecting anything in return. Let me pray.
Let the voice of truth